So let me just give a little bit of background. This is the second of the GCTC Transportation Supercluster presentations. We're going to be doing them monthly from now on. Next month's December's will be early. We'll do it on the 12th, so that's 2 weeks earlier than usual. And we have arranged for FIWARE, our European partners, to give a presentation on some of the work that they're doing in the transportation space. The wiki has a lot of information on it, including a bit of information about upcoming meetings. If you type in gctc.modelato.org, that'll take you to the main page, and you can find all the material there. Today's presentation is from Kat Nikolovsky of Hack Oregon. And Kat, I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Wolf. I'm glad to be here. So for those of you who are sharing the screen, you can see the slides. It says Hack Oregon is kombucha, which is kind of a funny Portland reference because we drink and brew a lot of kombucha out here. But the reason that I wanted to start off this way is to conceptualize really what Hack Oregon does as an organization, which is pretty distinct from the way that a lot of other nonprofits or even software companies operate. So I like to say, like kombucha, we go to whatever size container we're put in. And it's because our base is entirely volunteers. To give you a sense of scale, we are building pretty significant software systems starting from scratch. As far as we can work with data that is somewhat in the public domain, often isn't really accessible to government or leadership, or most often, certainly not the public, and look at ways that we can creatively bring together insight on issues. And we'll publish the results of analysis, but we also have a focus on building systems that kind of perpetuate a lot of access to this material, both in a raw data format, but in APIs and also visualizations and interfaces. So the way that Hack Oregon approaches these projects is we have a season. We will pick 5 different themes on some civic or public, important topic of importance. We will spin up teams of volunteers to address those themes, and we'll train our volunteers somewhere between half of them will train for about 3 to 6 months before they come into the project room, and we'll work for another 6 months. And the whole season ends with a big demo day where it's just kind of a fun audience vote on favorite projects. One of the things that has changed over the past, so Hack Oregon's been around for 4 years. We've done about 15 or so different projects. We started realizing that we need to streamline our technology stack, the importance of being able to standardize certain data techniques, create open source tools that are custom to the needs of building software in this large open source setting. We've got, to give you a sense of scale, about 2,000 applications for our Portland season. We will take 125 volunteers locally. Half of them will be experts that will receive expert training, and another half, and that'll be short, like seminar-based, peer-led training. Another half of our volunteers will be somewhat junior, so maybe at the level where they have 1 to 2 years of working experience, and we'll give them significant training to come in to work on these data projects. And so on the screen here, you can see we are just at the point where we're starting to announce our project themes for this upcoming year. I'll just read them for those of you that don't have it. Disaster resilience, transportation systems, housing affordability, local elections, and urban development. And the reason that we selected these themes is because we feel that they are broadly resonant with infrastructure that is very siloed in Portland, but also in other places. We tend to, when we think about neighborhoods, it's not just about affordable housing, transportation systems, and all of the development and schools. They all come together to make a multi-dimensional place. But oftentimes data isn't treated that way. And certainly when it comes to warehousing and to access, it's quite a lot of work to be able to take take all of that information and to get it parsed into something that can really start to give us a deeper lens on insight. But because we have this large volunteer base that's pretty adept, we can do a lot of that heavy lifting really quickly. And we've built a platform called Civic. We just got a beta version out in May, and we're going to be working throughout the year to publish all 5 of the themes and projects onto Civic. And yeah, is it someone have it? Somebody say something? Okay.
Was there a question?
Okay.
I had it too a little bit. I'm muting a few people as we go just to keep things from getting noisy. I apologize for that, but please feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, I realize this is kind of, it's a lot of information all at once. So if anyone has a question, feel free. All right, so I'll keep going. And so what I want to focus on today is talking about how we're going to approach our transportation systems project. Portland, because we have this base, we will be working to maintain the platform. We'll be working to maintain the platform and to do a lot of the data modeling and setting up templates that could be visual or could be tool-based to help make it easier for these projects to be more reproducible. And in particular, we'd like to get several other cities on board reproducing the transportation systems project so that we can do cross-analysis with different cities. And we have support in terms of training volunteers, in terms of galvanizing that network. And of course the platform, because we've got hosting and different deployment pipelines, maintenance, a whole bunch of training and open source material for being able to work on getting your own data ready to use. We really want to test out the reproducible potential, not just for scaling the technology, which is the Civic platform, but also the methodology around volunteers working. We want to show that this is an approach that is effective to create insight that really wouldn't have existed any other way, and that it's not a phenomenon just in Portland. And so before we start to dive into really the data around transportation and what we're thinking about digging into this year, I just want to say that there's a lot of comparisons to Hack Oregon, as like you've heard of hackathons before, but this is much more like a sustained year-long hackathon where we are curating every single aspect of participation with our volunteers. We ask for a lot. Typically a volunteer position, they'll go through 2 or 3 different phases of interviews. Many times this will also require training. And we ask for about 10 hours a week of commitment for at least 6 months going into the project season. And this may not be as intense in other places if we're looking to reproduce work that's been done. But I think that there have been a lot of open source, open data, hackathon inspired groups that have been losing momentum as we've been gaining momentum, because they're looking at short bursts, short sprints, bringing together, a lot of marketing around, highly visible events. And we've been a little bit under the surface, invisible, just working really hard in a sustained and directed way. And we will do hackathons and visible events, but when we do that, it will be like a hackathon where our entire group, that there's a reason to have the 125 or 150 of them together. And we're all working like a pop-up, department at an enterprise company, delivering one platform that has 5 different data applications running on it. So it's pretty incredible to actually experience. And keep in mind on this call, if you live in a city where you think that you might want to join in on this style of building projects, I'd love to talk to you after this call. And I think that there's a lot of potential here to show that volunteer open source led build cycles can be really, really effective for R&D on topics that, especially when it comes to integration and complex systems analysis like this, multivariable, just challenges. I think that this might be a really effective model to look at. So let's move forward. This is just a quick slide to show we had done a little bit of work on a transportation theme in the past. It's called State of Motion. I think we're going to be bringing this brand forward to our next season's project. And it kind of is evocative of multimodal transportation. And we're really looking at this from a systems perspective. Today, I think the core of what I want to focus on is looking at a trend of declining transit ridership in Portland and how this might be a national trend. Just a little bit of a mission statement here. Okay, so this is pretty recent data. This is all from September and October, where this is released. TriMet, transit agency in Portland. As you can see from this chart, we're looking at a long-term trend, 2001 to 2016, of declining ridership. This is both on and off peak for buses. And for the MAX line, we have a long-term trend that is rising, but around 2013, you can see that it peaked in 2012 and it's been declining since about 2012, 2013. And there's a board of directors meeting that you can watch the entire presentation on YouTube. They don't necessarily they can't point to any one factor for why this might be the case. And interestingly, an organization called Transit Center, which I actually forget where they're based out of, but somewhere on the East Coast, they released an article that's talking about Portland's decline in ridership, referencing this TriMet data. And they're thinking that economic displacement might be a driver of this ridership loss. And I encourage you to read that full article. Here's a couple of the maps that they put together, looking at home value. So this is a big topic of discussion in Portland, where we have a housing crisis, and there's a lot of tension in the city around the rising cost of housing, how we're responding in terms of density and urban growth boundary. And the city of Portland often talks about a push where people might be displaced maybe displaced out of Portland entirely, or sort of out into the fringes. This is an equity issue as well. We know that the housing crisis is disproportionately affecting people of color and other vulnerable communities. And it's not totally clear what types of policy interventions or infrastructure approach is going to intervene. But it's kind of on everybody's mind. And looking at this through the lens of transportation infrastructure is a little bit underserved. And for the moment, I think that we're looking at this data somewhat separately with just the transit lines overlaid. So I don't know that we can read too much into this, but you can see that we've had, more than 125% change in value of the single family residence near the urban core, and that we're seeing less of that spike out as you start to get into the suburbs. Another thing that is worth just considering here is that this is based on tax lot data, and it's fairly accurate as a metric and useful model, but there are challenges with tax lot data being completely accurate as an assessment means. Here's, and again, all these maps were put together by Transit Center. Ridership change from 2001 to 2016. You can see that the gain over, you're starting to see more transit use out toward the suburban area, and it's a little patchy as you move in toward the center. Again, I'm not sure by looking at this map if there's really a lot of correlation about what's going on in inner Portland, but it does appear that we've got increased ridership gains toward the outer edges of the city. One thing I don't know, and maybe it's in the article and I just missed it, but I can't tell here if they are maybe counting gains as also new stops that went in, if they had built infrastructure somewhere in the middle between 2001 and 2016, and that they're seeing gains because it's new. That could also account for some of this, and that would be something we'd want to look into. Okay, so as we move into this stuff, I want to take a leap into some work that HAC Oregon has done on affordable housing, and this is already published in our civic beta. It's kind of a snapshot of a limited view of data that we have, but what I think is fascinating, we are looking at voter registration data here. This is coming from the Secretary of State's office in Oregon. In theory, this is public data that you would purchase for a $500 fee. You would then get a dump of data, which shows you a snapshot of what that database, voter registration database, looks like at that moment in time. We were interested in getting a versioned history of more than what that database just looks like at any given moment, but what could we possibly look at individuals that are changing their voter registration and moving from address to address, and look at people as vectors in the city to try to understand something in the census gap. This is a challenge for the Portland's Housing Bureau. We don't really know where people are going if they're being displaced. When did this start to occur? What's going on with particularly rentals and single family homes? No cause lease evictions. There's absolutely no paper trail on that in Portland. And so there's a lot that we don't know about what's actually going on in the housing trend. So that's where we started with this, with the Secretary of State's office, just wondering if we could follow and try to see some type of pattern. And I think, honestly, we were expecting to see the push. We were expecting to be able to define that displacement a little bit more. The first challenge that we had to deal with is, and this is not unique to Oregon, the Secretary of State's office, believe it or not, doesn't keep a versioned database. They didn't set it up that way, and they probably never really thought that anybody was going to use the data to try to look at housing displacement, but really we had to go back through. It took us about 3 months of just working on the politics side, but also on the data side, to recover enough snapshots going back about 10 years to 2006 that we could start to put together some trends. So here we go. I mean, this is really the first time that anybody's looked at this data over time in Oregon, and to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been done anywhere when it comes to trying to understand something about rental and shift in livability. So what we've got here is just a pretty simple Portland's aging. There's data that shows this in other places, but one thing that is interesting as well is that Portland has, really thought of itself as a younger city, and we did somewhere in between 2006 and 2016 pass the national average in terms of. So we're on the scale of things a little bit of an older city, where in 2006 we were a little bit of a younger city. We're seeing a trend toward shared households. So that was something that we wanted to look at, voters that are registered, more than 3 registrants in a household. So, and these are all adults because they're registered voters. So what does that look like? It's definitely on the rise in terms of shared housing. We're going to look at the average age here. Again, this top one is the line that you saw first, that our average age in Portland went from about, it looks like something like almost 42 to about 45. And that this blue line down below, that is also a trend where the average age of registered voters, or people, if you take that as a proxy for people in Portland, it's rising. So it's still younger than the overall average, but trend toward shared households, and that trend is getting older. Now, here we have a little GIF of showing the distribution of age in voters that are participating in shared housing. So by shared housing, we were thinking that it might be an indication that folks are renting, but we're looking at the distribution. It's a count of actual ages. So for all of those individuals who are sharing part of a shared household, how old are they? And we don't know from this graph what the average household age is, but what we can see is that in total, of course, the whole thing is trending a little older, as we saw, but we see this shift where the highest distribution of, folks in their 20s, and then there's another peak at around like 55 to 60. And when we saw this, we were thinking, that's interesting. I wonder if there's something going on with this housing crunch where we're seeing people who are past 50 years old starting to live together more. Are these communities that are roughly in the same age? Because when you look at the 20 to 30 bracket, it makes sense that when you're younger, that would be a high, popular time to be in a shared household. But when we actually started to count the average age by household, we saw the complete inverse of that pattern. So here we've actually got this age distribution. The average age of a shared household is right in the middle.
How do you?
Go ahead, Will.
Yeah.
A lot of feedback there. Do you want to try one more time?
Can you actually hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Good. Okay. Sorry about that. How are you defining a shared household? Is this people at the same address? Would this include, for example, some of the high-rise buildings in the Pearl District?
This will be three individuals, and we also did it for 4 individuals. The trends were the same. So if you have 3 distinct voters registered at one address, that's a shared household.
Got it. So probably then would include the Pearl District, right? So you can imagine shared households at the high end of income as well as at the low end of income.
Oh, so actually, there's some particularities with the data. So we're able to know, for example, who's in an apartment. And so if you are 1 or 2 people living in an apartment building, that is not counted as a shared household.
Got it. Okay, that was what I was trying to understand, is could you split that out?
Yeah, we split that out. And another thing that we also split out were homeless shelters, that we were able to look at that, and senior centers. So those are not included here. One thing that we did not do that we could do in the future is actually look at last names as well, so we can see who is really related and who's married and who's kids. And this is this particular chart that we're looking at here is where we're showing where the highest distribution of individuals in shared households were in their early 20s, and that's starting to trend late 20s, early 30s. Second highest distribution is 50 to 55. Now that's trending 55 to 60. Then when we look at if they were separate, where we got 20 somethings living together and 55 somethings living together, we would see that same pattern emerge when we're looking at the average combined age, but that's not what we see. So it looks as though we've got people in their early to late 20s living with, in shared households with people aged 55 to 65. And this is trending older. So one thing that we're thinking from this data is that this is not a trend where we're just seeing people in their 20s living together in rentals longer, or that we're seeing folks that might be financially pressured in their 50s and 60s moving in together when they hadn't been in the past. I think that this might indicate that we've got intergenerational shared households. We've got adult children that are moving back in with their parents who may be homeowners. So another reason why we think that is on the next slide here. And this was one of the most surprising ones to me. We looked to follow individuals who were 21 in 2006 and see where did they actually go. And just for the sake of visuals here, I've just got 4 neighborhoods on this little animation, but where they all start out, and distinctly, these are in Portland, a mix of sort of what you'd see as trendy neighborhoods that became much more gentrified since 2006, and other neighborhoods that are considered working and diverse neighborhoods that have also been perhaps pressured. What we are looking at looks more like a scramble than an actual push out of the city. And on the next slide here, we can see this was true really across every single neighborhood type, no matter what the income or demographic really looked like. Following the 21-year-olds if you were living in a particular neighborhood in 2006 in Portland, you've got about a 25% chance that that person still lives in that neighborhood 10 years later, about a 30 to 40% chance that they moved to any other random neighborhood in Portland, and a 40 to 45% chance that they are just not in the city anymore. So here's what we don't know, because we didn't include this in the analysis, and we will going into next season. We only looked at the border of Portland. So if we were to include our surrounding suburban neighborhoods, if we were to see that a significant portion of that 40 to 45% that had totally left Portland are actually just going to suburbs, that would be interesting. I don't know that right now, but what it does look like, and this was a surprise to us, is that we are not seeing a consistent trend of young people over the last 10 years that were pushed out of the city. And in fact, it kind of goes to indicate, I mean, along with this multi-generational household trend, we're seeing that people are making it work. We're not seeing that young people are wanting to leave the city. They're hanging in there, and they really could be anywhere. So this is all coming back around to the transportation conversation, because the Transit Center had published that article looking at, is economic displacement part of the reason why we're seeing a decline in ridership, and that we're starting to see ridership gains toward the suburban edge of Portland. And, bus ridership is certainly on a long-term slow decline, but when we had seen gains in max ridership that are starting to fall in the last few years, it's interesting just to consider what this really means in terms of infrastructure and looking ahead. Is this really about density and demand, or are people not as interested in transit right now? So here's another one that's showing sort of something surprising. It's certainly not a push. So as the youth are scrambling, here is the age of registered voters. So for everybody who was living in shared housing, we start to see that in 2006, it's younger, right? And then it gets older from the outside in. So we'll see that by the time we get to 2016, it's actually squeezing the inner core. So we thought that might have been displacing the youth and pushing them out, but it seems more like it's just covering them up, and that the youth are scrambling. So here's another thing just at the end to throw a wrench in this whole projection, or if we think we have a handle on what's going on, it sort of shows us that we really, it's a lot at play here. But in 2008, so we were looking at the average age of a new voter who is never before registered in Oregon. So they had no address on file. So who's registering for the first time? Now, this could be that they are young people coming of age and registering for the first time, or that you have lived here for a while and you just never registered to vote. We looked at this 2008, so it's an Obama year, where we had massive voter registration outreach, peak times, and we saw that we've got the big distribution in people in their 20s that are registering to vote. So there's definitely a youth effort there, but that we've also got a bunch of people who are in their 50s and 60s that are also registering to vote. And you could infer that a good percentage of these people are actually just new to Portland. And when we look at this again, another huge election turnout year for Portland, we don't see that spike at all in the 50s and 60s. We see, and again, this is not turnout. This is new voters that are registering for the first time. It's hugely young. So even though Portland is getting older, we're also seeing that we've got a ton of young people living here. And it's likely that a lot of them are attracted to living in the urban core, regardless of what the cost of living is. If anything, we started out this project, I thought that we might see, there's this myth that people are coming in from California, New York, that are with all of this tech money and just buying houses. And we thought, well, what if those houses had 5 renters in them? And then all of a sudden those 5 renters are displaced by a young couple of 2. We couldn't really find any evidence of that in the data that we looked at. And we want to look again, and we want to look at this at a lot more angles. But here are some questions that we want to ask of data sets like this, and include more things on ridership and other types of sensor data and traffic data that we can get our hands on, and see if this decline in ridership, which TriMet mentioned to me, corresponds to a national decline in ridership. And for other cities, like Austin, that are also experiencing similar types of growth and youth moving in, do these trends hold up? So how is increasing density impacting transit ridership? But what does that mean when it's the Max Line ridership slowed in 2013? Again, like bringing up this idea, is it declining use or declining need? Alternate modes of transportation, including things like Uber, is there something about displacement to folks that are being priced out or being pushed? Is this responsible for a loss in ridership? So folks that were using transit in the city center now are in this last mile that are not able to access transit. What if that's the case? How can we really design infrastructure for last mile solutions to be effective? What does the infrastructure look like moving forward to plan for what's coming next? And more than anything, I think that all of these questions boil down to something that I had heard from the executive director of TriMet several years ago at a conference. He said, data can do some powerful things. It will tell you something that you think is true is actually true. And sometimes it shows you something that you would always assumed is just not true at all. And then he said, we have always known that transportation and transit systems work less well for people who need it the most. But now we have the data to show that that is actually true. And the question is, what do we do about it? So it's a great soundbite, but you know what? I talked to TriMet about this recently. I don't think that they really do have the data on what that means, or it's a complicated question from a data perspective, because how are you defining people that need it the most? What does this mean working less well? There's things that we can do to track ridership. We can track the GPS feed on the buses. We can look at laying in demographics and other kinds of different shift, but that's largely still an open question about how can we talk about transit. Does it work less well for people who need it the most? Are those people who are in the suburbs? I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that we could build a model and we could do it. It would be a ton of work to get all of this information in. But with the Hack Oregon model that we have with volunteers, if we create a very strong call to action, we can actually build, I think, the the resources that we need, and we can centralize a lot of this data warehousing, and building the applications, the analysis on top of that can be very fast. And I think we're kind of running a little bit long on time here, so I'll just breeze through this. But the idea that if we build this network of data, this mushroom circle that I've got, rather than going viral, you know, I see data much less like a commodity and more like carbon, right? So we're just trying to get that into a useful form, and, you know, just like a fungal mat that's underneath the surface, you get a rain to come along, and all of those applications really pop up pretty quickly. So I think that we can find out the answers to a lot of these questions. But what I could work with and use some collaboration with a network of smart cities and transportation superclusters, thinking about what challenges your cities are facing, what data you think you have. Probably a lot of it is going to match up with other readily available data sources in the transportation, somewhere in the public domain. Even if those are not actually public today, I think that if we request them, we could get data on ridership and other things from these agencies. So happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. That was great. Questions from anybody? Either clarifications or questions?
I had a question. This is Chris with Electric Cab.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was looking at your map, and that was getting me really curious about your microtransit situation, particularly with the last mile. Are you aware of how would I put this? Are you aware of the transit authority's willingness to integrate with last mile providers as far as data sharing? Because what we're doing down here in Austin is we're partnered with Cap Metro, and we're sharing our data, and we're increasing their ridership. Is there any willingness by the transit authority in Portland that you know of?
So I'll answer this with what I know, which is really speculative. Let me just put that as a caveat. And maybe Will will have something to add. So I can answer this by saying how willing the transit agency is to share data with us. And it's lukewarm. I think that they are conducting a lot of their own analysis, and when it comes to anything like funding or even giving staff time to work with us on getting this data, they're not really invested in working with third parties, is my assessment at the moment. But I also think that could be different coming from a third mile or like a last mile type of partner. What we would do, though, I think that for Hack Oregon, I think that we are going to get all of the data from Portland that we need. We may not get a ton of support from TriMet themselves, but some of these questions too, like what we're asking TriMet to give us, runs into similar problems like what we had with the Secretary of State, like the GPS feed for buses. That's a publicly available API, but it doesn't go back historically beyond just maybe they have a couple years online. But we're looking at, wanting to get really longitudinal analysis. Can we get all of that data for the last 10 years? They may or may not have warehoused that at all, or how difficult is it to share? I mean, we're asking them to kind of do some work to really take an inventory, and that's asking for staff time. And when they have other priorities, we have to make a really strong call to action for them to rise to that occasion, partnering up with more and more of the supercluster partners that show that we're reproducing this work in places like Austin, or that Austin will give it to us, right? And so we're going to do that analysis there. Portland, don't you want to be a part of it? Also, when we get that data, it means that you can have it because we're going to open source it, and we'll build APIs, we'll do the work on the infrastructure so that it's easy to access for other partners. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It took us years to get into the inner workings of Cap Metro. So believe me, I understand the lack of enthusiasm sometimes with transit agencies. But from what I've found that works, at least here in Austin, is we got the DOE grant, and we're actually bringing people to their last mile, or providing last mile to their rail. And once they saw a marked increase in ridership, and that's what I'm getting the feeling of how to approach Portland, is we can actually show you how many more passengers we can bring to mass transit. Don't just take our word for it, like maybe a pilot program. This sounds like something I should approach with a pilot rather than just a full-on RFI or RFP.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think that TriMet is going to see this as a win-win when we're done. I think that they just don't really want it, and like a lot of entities that are, TriMet is sort of a hybrid. It's not fully government, but this, at the same sense, they're risk averse, and there's public money on the table here, and so they're less willing to go into technology projects sometimes, or with third parties until they see this proven out. And so if all that happens is that we end up just getting the raw data that we want, I'm comfortable that we can work with this and produce something that might actually turn the dial on their last update, which is that here's the decline, and they can't quite pinpoint what's going on. I think that I'd like to see what we could do to bring something new to the table, because our teams are quite high capacity. We should be able to look at something interesting. If that includes some other last mile data about bringing in transportation or bringing in new ridership to transit, that would be really interesting.
I don't know if anybody's on from TriMet, but if you are, you feel free to chip in here. It would certainly be really interesting to be able to get some kind of an analysis that shows the impact on transit of last mile solutions. So, so if there is some way to sort of cross inform between Austin and Portland, that would be very interesting to take a look at. And I think it'd be interesting data for the other cities too. As you point out, no city really wants to be the experimental point, but when the data is there that shows last mile solutions improve use of transit systems, that would be very compelling data. So if there's some way we can construct an analysis that lets us look at how these systems have helped or how they impact the system, whether they help or not, it would be extremely valuable. Something we could share with other cities.
Hey,
What's something? Oh, sorry.
This is Elliot from Metro. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for the presentation. Metro is a regional planning agency for the Portland area, and we maintain a travel model that we use to evaluate the type of questions that you're talking about, particularly about kind of trade-offs between different travel options. We also routinely get approached by private data vendors that are trying to sell us data that they've collected to help us inform those decisions, particularly for some of the newer options that are available. So I'm wondering if you're coordinating with any regional agencies that run travel models or any of those data vendors in the work that you do.
I can speak to that. If that was in reference to the data with Electric Cab.
No, I was asking about the Hack Organ work.
Oh, sorry.
So, hi, thank you. I'm glad to hear that someone from Metro is on the call. I have not, we are right now in the beginning stages of building the partnerships for what's going to be our season, and we have 5 different projects and a pretty small staff. And so I think that one of the reasons for this could just be that we haven't reached out, and I'm not sure what the potential is in terms of interest in data sharing. I mean, I'd be really open to it, but at the moment, we're not. In fact, like this transportation project is one of the least supported themes that we have. And it was a real, almost like a kind of a gut check to go forward with launching it for our community, because it's the only one without an agency behind us. I mean, TriMet turned us down, even for staff time to help. And the other, but there's a lot of data that's available, and TriMet did make it seem as though if we were given a really specific ask for like some data that we could get it. And I'm kind of going out on a limb here thinking that we're going to find national support because this is a trend that's happening in other places, and particularly Austin. I've been talking with the city through the lens of affordable housing there, and I just see that transportation is so deeply integrated into these aspects of urban development and affordability, and looking at these things over time, and also trying to get a really good snapshot of where we are today, especially in the census gap, is a worthwhile endeavor, and we're going to figure it out. But we're definitely, if we find partners that want to see the outcomes of these kinds of questions just as much as we do, that's a huge benefit. This project at the moment is really moving forward because I think that the community wants to see what we can do with all of this information. And I think that they're willing to put the work in, even if it's not one of those that's like really lockstep with the official city partner. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Kat, have you had a chance to look at sort of general availability of open data in not just Portland but in other cities? I mean, it's just sort of a general question. How much of this data to do these kinds of analysis is broadly available? I know a lot of cities like to think that they're open data cities. Are cities doing a good job of getting data out that lets these kind of analysis be done, or does it require
it's going to require an ask. The data that cities have out often are just a couple years, like maybe it'll go back to 2012 or something like that. There is like a feed of GPS bus data, for example. This is one of the most common types of open data resources that a transit agency will have, is something that will allow you to map where the buses are. But what it doesn't show you is where the buses have been, what the routes were and are, looking at trying to map incidents against those different situations where buses are historically. I think that in terms of a big data project, certainly our system could handle 10 years of that for multiple cities. But I think it will vary how cities have actually been storing that data themselves, if they are. So that's one request that we're looking to make, is to try to get as much historic GPS data as possible. It's reasonable to think that the transit agencies have that. And I think that it's not very sensitive data. I think that we could have access to it if it exists. The challenge is if it hasn't been maintained that way. The other thing that we're really interested in is just getting deaggregated ridership data. If there is ridership data available online, like I think through TriMet right now, it's aggregated and it's just a couple years. We'd like raw data on ridership times and location. So I think that the key to this is to come up with a really good product concept and say, well, okay, if we had all of this data, here's what we could bring that's new to relate this back to affordable housing and some of this density conversation and last mile. And it's going to require that you put your data into it. But if you do, we have the model ready, and we're going to be able to work with that data and open source it back to you in a format that's more easily, readily available. And we'll also build an application on top of it so that the general public can engage. And overwhelmingly, I think it's going to be beneficial. And it's going to answer some questions and bring up tons more questions. But we'll have the infrastructure locked and loaded to be able to move forward. And so if we come with strong product concepts, what we want to do with the data, and that we go after several cities at once and say, hey, this is a request. Do you have this data, and will you give it to us? And if you don't quite have it, can we work with you to help make it easier for you to be able to release it publicly? My guess is that it probably exists somewhere within most cities. Whether or not it's public, probably no city, even Portland, they don't have on hand what we need.
Thanks. It's obviously worth more discussion. I want to be careful of people's time here. We've used up the hour. I much appreciate it. I think this was really excellent, Kat. I much appreciate you taking the time today. If there's any last question before we wrap up, then I'll just bring it to a close. Thanks, everybody. I'll look forward to seeing you again on the 12th of December.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kat. Was there a question there?
I was just asking if Catherine's slides would be available.
Yes, the CAD slides are available on the wiki at the moment in a PDF format you can download. And my hope is that that the recording that we just made is good enough that we can post that too. I'll try and get that done this week.
Let me also say that if you posted it in PDF form, some of the GIFs won't work for the data over time. So we have at our website that housing project that you can go through to find the live data, and I'll send you both the link to that as well.
That would be great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. See you soon.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Thank you.